The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Monarch Ballroom threw sharp, fractured light across 300 executives in dark, tailored suits, yet the massive room felt as silent as an abandoned cathedral. I stood near the edge of the stage, my hand gripping the mahogany railing, my pulse hammering in my ears. Across the podium, Liora Hawthorne stood tall behind the microphone. She was the CEO of Hawthorne Global, a woman every man in the industry feared, admired, and kept at arm's length. Her sharp emerald eyes scanned the sea of shareholders, stopping cold when they locked onto mine. In her right hand, she held a faded, yellowed piece of paper, folded into a tight square. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one in the room dared to breathe. Then, her low, composed voice cut through the heavy silence. For 5 years, I thought every person who entered my life wanted a piece of my company, my influence, or my name. I built walls so thick that no one even tried to cross them. I was wrong, because the only man who ever stayed was the one who didn't even know who I was when he saved my mother's life. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even process the sound of my own breath. I stared at the folded paper in her pale fingers, recognizing the elegant, trembling handwriting of an elderly woman who had shared tea with me on a cold park bench every Tuesday afternoon for 2 months. It hit me like a sudden, crushing physical blow. The mysterious, lonely daughter my park friend had spent weeks worrying about was the ice-cold CEO who had run my company with an iron fist. And the blind date I had tried so desperately to avoid was the exact moment our worlds collided. But to understand how I ended up standing at the edge of that stage, staring into the eyes of the most untouchable woman in the city, you have to go back 2 months to a quiet Tuesday morning in the city park. The autumn wind was howling through the golden leaves, scattering cold rain across the stone pathways near the central fountain. I was 29 years old, an operations coordinator at Hawthorne Global, carrying a warm paper cup of black coffee on my way to the corporate headquarters. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman in a beige cardigan was leaning heavily against a wooden bench, her left hand clutching her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. She had dropped her umbrella into a muddy puddle, her knees buckling under her own weight. Dozens of hurried commuters in heavy coats rushed past her, their eyes glued to their phones, completely oblivious to her distress. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I dropped my briefcase onto the bench, knelt beside her on the damp gravel, and supported her shoulders. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Stay calm, I've got you." Her hands were ice cold and trembling, her face pale as parchment. I immediately called emergency services, unbuttoned her heavy collar to help her breathe, and spoke in a steady, reassuring tone until the paramedics arrived 10 minutes later. As they checked her blood pressure on the gurney, she gripped my sleeve tightly, her warm brown eyes filled with immense relief. "Young man, please, let me repay you. What is your name?" I offered her a gentle smile, patting her hand softly before stepping back. "My name is Cassian, ma'am, and you don't owe me anything. Just get some rest and take care of yourself." I refused to leave until I saw her safely into the ambulance, ensuring her personal belongings were handed to the medical team. I thought that was the end of a simple, random act of kindness on a rainy morning. I had no idea that simple decision was about to dismantle the entire trajectory of my life. 3 days after the incident in the park, I was taking my usual lunch break at a small, quiet tea shop 2 blocks away from the Hawthorne Global Tower. As I carried my tray toward a corner table, a soft, familiar voice called out from a velvet armchair near the window. "Cassian, is that really you?" I turned in surprise to find the silver-haired woman from the park sitting by a low wooden table, a steaming teapot resting in front of her. She was wearing a modest beige knit cardigan and a simple pearl necklace, looking far healthier and more vibrant than she had 3 days ago. My face lit up with a genuine smile as I walked over. "Ma'am, it's so wonderful to see you looking so well. How is your heart feeling?" She laughed softly, gesturing for me to sit down in the vacant chair opposite her. "Call me Evelyn, dear. And my heart is perfectly fine, thanks entirely to a young man who didn't walk past an old woman in the rain." I tried to decline when she insisted on buying my lunch, but Evelyn possessed a gentle, unyielding persistence that made refusal impossible. That afternoon turned into the first of many Tuesdays. Over the next 6 weeks, our casual encounters at the tea shop evolved into a cherished weekly tradition. Every Tuesday at 1 o'clock, I would step away from the chaotic pressure of the logistics department, and Evelyn would be waiting at our corner table with 2 hot cups of chamomile tea. Evelyn was perceptive, kind, and possessed an extraordinary warmth that reminded me of my late grandmother. She listened intently as I spoke about my life, my background in supply chain management, and the relentless stress of working at Hawthorne Global. I spoke openly about my formidable, larger-than-life CEO without ever mentioning her actual name. She runs the entire firm like a grand military operation, I explained one afternoon, taking a sip of hot tea. Every man on the executive floor is terrified of her. She never smiles, she never raises her voice, and she looks through people like they're made of glass. But sometimes, late at night when the floor is empty, I see her sitting alone at her desk looking so exhausted. It's like her success is a cage she can't escape. Evelyn listened quietly, her warm brown eyes softening with a strange, tragic understanding. She leaned back against her armchair, letting out a soft, melancholic sigh. That sounds heartbreakingly familiar, Cassian. My own daughter is very much like your boss. She is brilliant, independent, and runs a massive organization, but her competence has become a fortress. Men are intimidated by her. Colleagues admire her from a distance. Everyone wants something from her. Her money, her authority, her approval. No one ever approaches her simply to ask how her day was. She has everything in this world, except someone who isn't afraid of her. I looked at Evelyn with deep empathy, shaking my head gently. It must be lonely for her. Evelyn smiled softly, reaching across the table to lay her warm hand over mine. It is, dear, which is why I keep praying she meets someone like you, someone who sees a human being instead of a title. Neither of us revealed names. I assumed Evelyn's daughter ran a local fashion firm or a law practice. Evelyn knew I was a junior coordinator. We were two strangers sharing quiet moments of truth, unaware that a massive storm was brewing inside the corporate tower above us. While my Tuesdays with Evelyn were filled with quiet warmth, my daily reality inside the headquarters of Hawthorne Global was a high-pressure battlefield. The company was an international logistics titan, managing billions of dollars in freight, supply routes, and corporate acquisitions. At 31, Liora Hawthorne was the youngest CEO in the firm's history, a woman of legendary intelligence and ruthless composure. Her tall, striking figure, crowned by long, straight golden blonde hair and severe emerald eyes, commanded absolute obedience whenever she stepped onto the floor. I worked on the 42nd floor as a senior operations coordinator, managing emergency freight diversions. From my desk near the glass hallway, I watched the daily dynamics of the corporate hierarchy with quiet fascination. Vice presidents double-checked their suits before entering her office. Senior directors stuttered during quarterly reviews. Men twice her age avoided making direct eye contact with her in the elevators, intimidated by her icy precision and sharp, uncompromising intellect. She didn't insult people, she simply demanded perfection and tolerated no weakness. Yet, because my desk was located near the executive exit, I began noticing subtle details that others missed. On long nights when global shipping lines faced sudden disruptions, Liora would remain in her top-floor office until 2 in the morning. Through the frosted glass partitions, I saw her silhouette standing motionless by the window, clutching a lukewarm mug of dark tea, looking out over the sprawling city lights. There was no arrogance in her posture during those quiet hours, only a crushing, solitary weight. One evening at 9 o'clock, after resolving a major port delay in the southern grid, I carried the final operational sign-off forms to her corner office. I knocked softly against the heavy glass door. "Director Hawthorne, I have the updated shipping manifests for your signature." She didn't look up immediately. She sat behind a massive black granite desk, her gold pen moving across a stack of financial audits. When she finally raised her sharp green eyes, her expression was as cold and unreadable as a marble statue. "Leave them on the tray, Coordinator Ross. Be sure the morning dispatch team receives a copy by 6. "Yes, Director," I replied politely, setting the papers down. As I turned to leave, I noticed a small, half-eaten sandwich sitting untouched on the corner of her desk beside a cold cup of coffee. Impulsively, without thinking, I paused near the door. "Director, if I may, the cafeteria on the concourse level is still open for 20 minutes. You've been here since 6 this morning. You should get a proper meal." The air in the room froze instantly. Liora stopped writing. Her emerald eyes locked onto mine with a sharp, piercing intensity that made my skin prickle. For 4 agonizing seconds, she didn't say a word. Then, her voice came through the silence, flat, clipped, and completely devoid of warmth. "My dining schedule is not part of your operational duties, Mr. Ross. You are dismissed." I felt a sudden flush of embarrassment heat my neck. I bowed my head briefly, stepped out into the hallway, and pulled the door shut. Unbelievable, I thought to myself, pulling my coat tighter. She really is made of ice. Everyone was right about her. Reflecting on those early months at Hawthorne Global, I realized how easy it is to misunderstand someone who carries immense responsibility. When you see a leader operating with cold efficiency, your natural instinct is to assume they lack emotion. But true strength often requires a person to bury their vulnerabilities so deeply that even their closest associates miss the pulse beneath the armor. Liora had carried the weight of her father's legacy, the expectations of hundreds of employees, and the constant threat of corporate rivals. Every harsh decision she made was designed to protect the entity her father had built. What none of us understood was that inside that impenetrable shell was a human heart longing for simple, unconditional connection. By the 6th week of our Tuesday coffee meetings, Evelyn's health had stabilized completely, but her determination to intervene in her daughter's life had reached a fever pitch. As we sat at our usual table, Evelyn set her teacup down with a deliberate click, looking at me with an unyielding, sparkling intensity. "Cassian, I am going to ask you for a very special favor, and I won't accept no for an answer." I raised an eyebrow, smiling cautiously. "That sounds ominous, Evelyn. What kind of favor?" Evelyn leaned forward, taking both of my hands in hers. "I want you to go on a blind date with my daughter. Just one dinner, one evening. If you two don't click, I promise I will never bring it up again. But please, do this for an old woman who wants to see her daughter smile." I shrank back slightly, feeling an immediate wave of hesitation. "Evelyn, I'm just a quiet operations guy. Your daughter is a high-powered corporate executive. She probably wants someone in her own social circle, a lawyer, an investment banker, a vice president. I don't think I'm what she's looking for." Evelyn shook her head firmly, her eyes shining with absolute conviction. "She doesn't need another title, Cassian. She is surrounded by titles every single day. She needs a genuine man who sees her as a human being. Promise me you will go to the Bistro Rouge this Friday at 8 o'clock. Please, Cassian." Looking into Evelyn's hopeful, pleading eyes, I found it impossible to say no. I let out a long, defeatist laugh and nodded. "All right, Evelyn, Friday at 8, Bistro Rouge. I'll be there." Evelyn beamed with pure delight, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small, folded handwritten note. "Take this. If she hesitates or acts defensive when she arrives, hand her this note. It has my handwriting on it. It will tell her everything she needs to know." Meanwhile, across the city on the top floor of Hawthorne Global headquarters, a nearly identical scene was unfolding. Evelyn had marched directly into Liora's private office, bypassing security, and set a restaurant address on her daughter's granite desk. Liora had stared at her mother in absolute disbelief. "Mother, this is absurd. I am preparing for the quarterly board audit. I don't have time for a blind date with a stranger." Evelyn had stood her ground with the quiet authority that only a mother possessed. "Liora, you have spent 5 years turning your life into a corporate spreadsheets manual. Every man you meet is either intimidated by you or trying to pitch you an investment idea. This young man is different. He is honest, kind, and he doesn't want a single thing from you. You will go to Bistro Rouge on Friday at 8 o'clock, or I will personally move into your penthouse and supervise your dinners myself." Faced with her mother's immovable ultimatum, Liora had finally yielded with a cold, reluctant sigh. Neither Cassian nor Liora had any idea of the massive explosion awaiting them at that restaurant table. On Friday evening at 8 o'clock, the atmosphere inside Bistro Rouge was dim, elegant, and filled with the soft ambient chatter of wealthy patrons and classical violin music. I sat at a small, candlelit corner table, wearing a crisp dark gray suit, feeling terribly out of place. I checked my watch every 2 minutes, nervously adjusting my necktie, holding Evelyn's folded note in my inner jacket pocket. At precisely 8:05, the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant swung open. The head host bowed respectfully as a tall, breathtaking woman stepped into the dining room. She was wearing a sleek, tailored dark navy evening blazer, her long, straight golden blonde hair falling gracefully over her shoulders, her emerald eyes scanning the room with sharp, predatory composure. Every head in the restaurant turned to watch her pass. My heart violently stopped in my chest, my breath seized in my throat. It was Liora Hawthorne. I froze as she approached my table, her high heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. When her eyes locked onto mine, her step faltered for a fraction of a second. A sudden, sharp look of total shock crossed her pale features, instantly replaced by a wave of severe, burning suspicion. She stopped 2 feet from the table, her arms crossing tightly over her chest, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy whisper. "Mr. Ross, what on earth are you doing sitting at my mother's reserved table?" I stood up instantly, my hands trembling slightly as I looked at her in complete bewilderment. "Director Hawthorne, I'm waiting for a blind date arranged by my friend Evelyn." Leora's eyes narrowed into slits of green fire. A cold, cynical laugh escaped her throat. Evelyn, you call my mother by her first name? Unbelievable. She took a step closer, her voice dripping with venomous disdain. So, this was your game, Cassian? You found out who my mother was, engineered a fake encounter in the park, manipulated a lonely elderly woman, and had her arrange a date so you could climb the corporate ladder at Hawthorne Global? You are even more despicable than the rest of them. The brutal accusation hit my chest like a physical sledgehammer. The blood rushed to my face, my shock instantly turning into a deep, agonizing humiliation. I didn't care about her corporate title or her billions. I cared about Evelyn's pure friendship, and having it slandered as a calculated corporate maneuver shattered my heart. I pulled my jacket tight, looking Liora straight in her burning green eyes with cold dignity. I don't care who you are, Director Hawthorne, and I had no idea Evelyn was your mother until this exact second. I came here out of respect for a sweet woman who bought me tea when I saved her life in the rain. But I will not stay here to be insulted by a boss who thinks the entire world revolves around her company. I turned on my heel, ready to walk out of the restaurant forever. But as I pulled my overcoat from the chair, Evelyn's folded note slipped from my inner jacket pocket, fluttering through the air and landing flat on the table beneath the candlelight. Leora's eyes fell upon the paper. She recognized the delicate, shaky silver script of her mother's handwriting. Her breath caught. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached out and unfolded the note. The letter read, Liora, if you are reading this, it means you have already accused this young man of having an agenda. He saved my life in the park 6 weeks ago when I collapsed in the rain. He stayed with me, called the ambulance, and refused a single penny of reward. He has been drinking tea with me every Tuesday, talking about his work with deep respect, completely unaware of who I am or who you are. He is the only man in this city who looked at me and saw a person instead of your mother. Please, for once in your life, stop looking for enemies and look at the man sitting in front of you. Silence fell over the table, a massive, suffocating silence that drowned out the entire restaurant. Liora stared at her mother's handwriting, her emerald eyes widening in absolute horror as the realization hit her like a lightning bolt. Her hand began to shake violently. The severe, arrogant CEO vanished in a single instant, leaving behind a pale, stunned woman staring at me in total, speech-bound shock. Liora lowered the paper slowly, her face drained of all color, her emerald eyes meeting mine with a raw, vulnerable horror I had never seen on the executive floor. You didn't know, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of her own shame. You really didn't know who she was. I stood near the table, my overcoat draped over my arm, my posture rigid with quiet pain. I knew her as Evelyn, a kind woman who liked chamomile tea and worried about her daughter's happiness. I didn't ask for her last name, and she never offered it. I don't want your money, Director Hawthorne. I don't want a promotion. And I don't want your corporate suspicion. I turned toward the exit, but before I could take 2 steps, Liora reached out. For the first time in 5 years, her hand touched my wrist, her fingers cold, trembling, and surprisingly soft. Cassian, please, she said, her voice dropping into a hushed, desperate murmur. Please, sit down. I was wrong. Please. I looked at her hand on my wrist, then up at her face. The untouchable CEO was looking at me with genuine, unguarded remorse. I took a deep breath, pulled back my chair, and sat down. That evening at Bistro Rouge shifted from a disastrous confrontation into a long, quiet turning point. For 3 hours, over untouched food and soft wine, we talked. But for the first time, we didn't talk as CEO and employee. We talked as 2 human beings who shared a bond through Evelyn. Liora explained, in quiet, hesitant fragments, why her walls were so high. When my father passed away 6 years ago and I took over Hawthorne Global at 25, every man in the industry tried to take advantage of my youth, she murmured, staring down at her wineglass. Board members tried to manipulate me. Competitors tried to court me to acquire our shipping tech. Even men I thought were my friends turned out to be working for rival firms or seeking board seats. After 3 years of betrayal, I learned that the only way to survive was to become unapproachable. I made myself an iceberg so no one could hurt me or my mother again. I listened intently, the anger in my heart melting into a deep, profound understanding. You built a fortress to protect your peace, I said softly. Liora looked up, her green eyes shimmering in the candlelight. Yes, but inside that fortress it gets very cold, Cassian. We agreed that night to keep our personal acquaintance strictly secret from the rest of the company. At work, we would maintain our professional hierarchy as CEO and coordinator. But outside the office, we agreed to visit Evelyn's house together for Sunday dinners. It was the beginning of a quiet double life that neither of us saw coming. Over the next 3 weeks, a quiet, wonderful rhythm established itself in our lives. At Hawthorne Global, everything appeared unchanged to the outside world. Liora ran executive board meetings with her usual fierce intellect, and I managed freight routing from my desk on the 42nd floor. But every Sunday evening, I would drive to Evelyn's elegant suburban home. Liora would arrive 20 minutes later, leaving her executive guard and luxury vehicle behind, wearing simple sweaters and comfortable jeans. Around Evelyn's dining table, the severe CEO disappeared entirely. Liora laughed at her mother's childhood stories, helped wash dishes in the kitchen, and shared quiet, comfortable silences with me by the fireplace. For the first time in years, Liora didn't have to perform, defend, or prove anything. She was simply Liora. And for me, seeing her lower her guard revealed a woman of profound warmth, sharp humor, and quiet beauty. However, our peaceful sanctuary was short-lived. Dark clouds were gathering within the upper management of Hawthorne Global. Theron Mercer, the 36-year-old senior vice president of corporate operations, had been plotting a quiet coup for months. Theron was an arrogant, sharp-eyed executive who believed he should have been named CEO after Leora's father died. He had spent years building alliances with conservative board members, waiting for a single mistake to challenge Leora's authority. Theron didn't just want the company. He understood Leora's deepest vulnerability, her absolute isolation. He knew that if he could prove Leora's judgment was compromised by personal relationships, the board would force her resignation. Through an internal security audit, Theron's assistant noticed that I had been invited to Evelyn Hawthorne's private residence 3 weekends in a row. Theron didn't know about the park encounter or the blind date. He simply saw an opportunity to craft a devastating narrative. On a stormy Thursday morning, Theron requested an emergency private meeting with Liora in her top-floor office. I was delivering logistics files to her executive assistant when I heard Theron's loud, arrogant voice echoing through the heavy oak doors. Liora, as senior vice president, it is my duty to inform you that your personal security is compromised. A junior coordinator named Cassian Ross has been secretly infiltrating your mother's personal life for weeks. He is manipulating an elderly woman to gain leverage over executive operational files. Inside the office, Leora's face went completely pale, but her posture remained rigid. That is absurd, Theron. Mr. Ross is a dedicated coordinator whose private life is none of your concern. Theron leaned over her granite desk, a malicious, triumphant smile curling his lips. Is it absurd, Liora, or are you letting your guard down for a nobody who engineered a fake friendship with your mother? I have already compiled a file for the board of directors. At next week's annual shareholder gala, I will present proof that you are allowing junior staff to manipulate your family for corporate access, unless, of course, you step down as CEO voluntarily. The threat dropped into Leora's office like a ticking time bomb. When Theron stormed out of the executive suite, his eyes caught mine in the hallway. He offered a cold, predatory smirk, stepping past me without a word. I walked into Leora's office, finding her standing motionless by the window, her hands clenched into tight fists, her breathing rapid and shallow. Liora? I asked softly, closing the heavy glass door behind me. She turned around, her emerald eyes filled with a mixture of intense anger and deep, familiar fear. He knows about Sunday dinners, Cassian, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Theron is going to present a distorted report to the board at the gala next week. He is telling them that you used my mother to gain access to corporate intelligence, and that I am compromised for allowing it. I felt a surge of cold fury ignite in my chest. He's using your fear of betrayal against you, Liora. He wants you to panic, push everyone away, and resign so he can take control. Liora looked down at her desk, her voice dropping into a heartbroken murmur. Maybe he's right, Cassian. Maybe every time I let someone close, it turns into a weapon against my family. Maybe I should just transfer you to another branch, or step down. I took 2 quick steps forward, stopping right in front of her desk, looking directly into her eyes with fierce conviction. No, absolutely not. You have spent 5 years running from shadows because you thought you were alone. You are not alone anymore, Liora. Theron is weaponizing your isolation, but his entire narrative relies on a lie. I'm not going anywhere, and we are not letting him ruin this company or your peace. For the next 4 days, while Liora managed the high-stakes preparations for the shareholder gala, I launched a quiet, relentless counter-investigation of my own. I called in every personal favor I possessed across the logistics department, partnering with Soren Reed, a battle-tested field manager who had served Hawthorne Global for a decade. Soren was loyal to Leora's late father and possessed deep access to internal server archives. Working late into the night at a private terminal offsite, Soren and I uncovered the real truth behind Theron Mercer's sudden move. Theron hadn't just discovered my visits to Evelyn's house, he had been actively leaking Hawthorne Global's confidential supply chain routes to a rival foreign logistics conglomerate for 8 months in exchange for offshore equity. His plan to remove Liora wasn't about protecting the board from a security breach. It was a desperate attempt to seize the CEO seat before his own treasonous financial audits came to light. I held the encrypted evidence in a silver flash drive, ready to dismantle Theron's entire trap. As the day of the Grand Monarch shareholder gala approached, the tension inside Hawthorne Global reached a boiling point. Theron Mercer spent 48 hours holding private, secret meetings with key conservative board members, feeding them poisoned rumors about Liora's declining judgment and my supposed infiltration of her family. On Monday afternoon, 3 days before the gala, Theron cornered me in the basement parking garage as I was loading operational files into my car. He stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, flanked by 2 large corporate security guards, his pinstriped suit gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Mr. Ross," Theron sneered, leaning against my car door with total arrogance, "you've played a very clever game, taking advantage of a lonely old woman in a park. But small-time operators like you always forget where they stand. By Thursday night, Liora Hawthorne will be forced out of the company, and I will be named interim CEO. If you resign tonight and hand over any files you've been working on with Soren Reed, I might refrain from having you blacklisted across the entire industry." I stood my ground, looking Theron straight in his cold eyes without a single trace of fear. "You're very confident, Vice President Mercer, but you're making one fatal mistake." Theron raised an eyebrow, a mocking smirk on his lips. "Oh? And what mistake is that, Coordinator?" "You think Liora is weak because she's quiet," I said in a steady, cold voice. "And you think I approached her mother for money. You spent your entire life measuring people by what they can steal from each other, so you can't even comprehend a relationship built on actual truth. Enjoy your competence while it lasts, Theron." Theron's smirk vanished, his face hardening into an ugly mask of rage. "Get out of my building, Ross. We'll see who is standing on Thursday night." I got into my car and drove away, my hands steady on the steering wheel. The trap was set, but Theron had no idea that the prey he was hunting had already turned the tables. While Soren and I finalized the technical evidence against Theron, a quiet, profound revelation was taking place at Evelyn Hawthorne's home. On Tuesday afternoon, 2 days before the gala, Evelyn noticed a stack of printed security reports sitting on Liora's kitchen counter during her daughter's brief lunch visit. The reports contained Theron's vicious allegations against me. When Liora returned to the kitchen after taking a corporate call, she found her mother sitting at the dining table, holding the reports in her trembling hands, tears streaming silently down her pale cheeks. "Liora, what is this?" Evelyn asked, her voice cracking with deep emotional pain. "Why is this man accusing Cassian of using me?" Liora sat beside her mother, taking her hands gently. "It's corporate politics, Mother. Theron Mercer is trying to use my acquaintance with Cassian to convince the board that I am unfit to lead. He wants me to resign." Evelyn wiped her tears, looking at her daughter with a sudden, sharp clarity. "And what has Cassian said about this? Has he come to you demanding that you defend his name? Has he threatened to quit?" Liora went silent for a moment, shaking her head softly. "No. In fact, he discovered that Theron was attacking him weeks ago. He didn't say a word to defend himself to the press, and he refused to let me transfer him. He has been working 80 hours a week with Soren Reed, quietly gathering proof to protect my position and my company, completely unconcerned with his own reputation." Evelyn gasped, a profound wave of emotion washing over her face. She reached into her cardigan pocket, pulling out a small velvet box containing a delicate silver locket, an heirloom given to her by Liora's father decades ago. She placed the locket into Liora's hands, closing her daughter's fingers tightly around it. "Liora, my sweet child," Evelyn murmured, looking deeply into her daughter's emerald eyes. "For 5 years you have lived in fear that every man who came near you was trying to take your crown. You built walls so high that no one could reach your heart. But Cassian stood by me in the rain when I was a stranger. He sat at my table every Tuesday expecting nothing. And now, he is risking his entire career to protect you without asking for a single word of praise. Don't you see, Liora? He isn't trying to take your crown. He is the only man who has ever stood beside you to help you carry it." Liora looked down at the silver locket in her hand, her throat constricting with an overwhelming surge of realization. The final remnant of her 5-year fortress collapsed into dust. She didn't just see a quiet coordinator anymore. She saw a man whose quiet, steady devotion had been guarding her life all along. On Wednesday night, the evening before the gala, The executive floor of Hawthorne Global was entirely dark except for the warm amber light spilling from Liora's top floor office. I had just finished encrypting the final financial audit files onto the silver flash drive when my office phone chimed. It was Liora. I walked down the quiet corridor and pushed open her heavy oak door. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering city skyline. She was wearing a simple black silk blouse, her long blonde hair falling over her shoulders. Beside her granite desk sat two porcelain mugs of hot tea. She turned around as I entered, her emerald eyes filled with a soft, radiant warmth that lit up the entire room. "Cassian," she said softly, gesturing toward the desk. "Come sit down. No files tonight, just tea." I smiled, walking over and taking a seat across from her. I picked up the mug, taking a slow sip. It was black tea with a faint touch of honey and cinnamon, exactly how I liked it. I looked up in mild surprise. "Did you make this?" Liora flushed slightly, offering a rare, breathtaking smile that made my heart leap against my ribs. "I asked my mother how you take it. I thought, it was time I served you for once." We sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the city lights twinkle below us. Then, Liora reached into her pocket and set the silver flash drive onto the desk between us. "Soren sent me the completed file an hour ago, Cassian. The evidence against Theron's offshore accounts is absolute. He will be arrested the moment he steps off the stage tomorrow night." I nodded quietly. "I'm glad your company is safe, Liora." Liora looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The company is safe, but what about you, Cassian? You let Theron slander your name for weeks. You let him threaten your career, and you never once complained to me. Why did you protect me like this?" I set my tea mug down, looking directly into her eyes with total, unfiltered honesty. Because 5 years ago, I saw a woman sitting alone at her desk late at night, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Everyone saw a CEO. I saw someone who was desperately lonely. And when I got to know you, I realized that your silence was never coldness. It was just a shield. I didn't protect you for a promotion, Liora. I did it because I care about you more than anything else in this city. Liora's breath caught in her throat. She reached across the granite desk, her trembling fingers intertwining tightly with mine. For the first time in 5 years, there were no walls, no titles, and no corporate fears between us. "Thank you, Cassian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Tomorrow night, I am going to tell the world the truth." The night of the Grand Monarch Shareholder Gala arrived with a cold, dramatic flair. Rain was pouring over the metropolis, beating against the massive glass dome of the ballroom where 300 of the nation's top logistics executives, board members, and journalists had gathered. Spotlights illuminated the high stage, where a grand wooden podium stood surrounded by floral arrangements. Theron Mercer moved through the crowd like a proud peacock, wearing a sharp pinstriped tuxedo, sipping champagne, whispering poisoned words into the ears of key board members. "Watch the podium tonight, gentlemen," Theron gloated quietly to the board chairman. "Liora Hawthorne's reign ends tonight. I have the files proving her gross security negligence." I stood near the rear of the ballroom beside Soren Reed, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, holding the master encrypted drive in my jacket pocket. Soren offered a quiet, battle-tested smirk, nudging my shoulder. "Look at him, Cassian. He thinks he's walking toward a crown. He has no idea he's walking straight onto a gallows." At 8 o'clock, the chime echoed through the speakers, signaling the start of the executive address. The room fell silent as Liora Hawthorne stepped onto the stage. She was breathtaking. She wore a severe, impeccably tailored dark navy evening suit, her long golden blonde hair pinned neatly, her emerald eyes burning with an unshakable, majestic composure. Every camera flash in the room erupted, capturing her regal presence. She stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. Beside the stage, Theron Mercer stood with his arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across his face, waiting for his moment to interrupt her speech and present his altered security files to the press. Liora scanned the massive audience, her gaze sweeping past board members, past journalists, until her green eyes found mine standing near the railing at the back of the room. She offered a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of absolute trust. Then she raised her hand, tapping the microphone, her commanding voice echoing through the vast ballroom. "Good evening, shareholders and members of the press. Tonight, before we discuss our quarterly expansion, I have a vital announcement regarding the security, integrity, and future of Hawthorne Global." The entire ballroom went dead silent. Cameras flashed continuously as Liora picked up a remote control, activating the massive LED screens behind the stage. For the past 8 months, Liora declared, her voice ringing clear and steady as steel, Hawthorne Global has been subjected to a deliberate, calculated corporate sabotage from within our highest executive ranks. Theron Mercer's smug smile instantly froze. The color drained from his face as the LED screens erupted with high-resolution documents, offshore bank accounts, encrypted email transmissions, and recorded shell company transactions, all bearing Theron Mercer's personal signature and digital encryption keys. Senior Vice President Theron Mercer, Liora continued, her cold emerald eyes locking onto Theron like a precision missile, has systematically leaked our proprietary supply chain algorithms to foreign competitors in exchange for $12 million in offshore assets. Furthermore, he attempted to stage a smear campaign against junior staff to cover his treason. Shouts of utter outrage erupted across the boardroom tables. Board members leaped to their feet in fury. Journalists swarmed forward, their cameras capturing Theron's pale, horrified face as two federal officers stepped out from the side wings of the stage, placing heavy steel cuffs over his wrists. Theron tried to speak, stuttering in absolute terror, but the officers dragged him quietly toward the side exit, stripping him of his freedom in front of the entire industry. As the security team led Theron away, the ballroom slowly quieted down, the shareholders staring up at Liora in overwhelming awe and respect. But Liora didn't immediately return to her corporate report. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulling out the folded, yellowed note her mother had written weeks ago. She held the paper up under the bright spotlights, her voice softening into a raw, deeply emotional cadence that captivated every single heart in the room. For 5 years, I thought every person who entered my life wanted a piece of my company, my influence, or my name. I built walls so thick that no one even tried to cross them. I was wrong. Because the only man who ever stayed was the one who didn't even know who I was when he saved my mother's life in the rain. He protected her without asking for reward, and he protected me without asking for praise. Liora stepped out from behind the podium. In front of 300 stunned executives, cameras, and shareholders, the untouchable CEO walked off the stage. She walked straight down the long center aisle, her high heels clicking softly against the carpet, her eyes locked entirely onto mine. She stopped right in front of me near the balcony railing. In front of the entire world, Liora Hawthorne reached out, taking my hand into hers, her emerald eyes shimmering with radiant, unguarded love. "Thank you, Cassian," she whispered softly, her voice carrying through the quiet room. "You brought me out of the cold." The aftermath of the gala swept through the business world like a massive tidal wave. Theron Mercer was convicted of corporate espionage and grand fraud, while Hawthorne Global entered its most prosperous quarter in history under Liora's undisputed leadership. But inside our personal lives, the grand corporate noise faded into a quiet, beautiful reality. 2 weeks after the gala, on a bright, sunny Tuesday afternoon, I walked into the familiar tea shop near the city park. The autumn leaves were floating gently past the windows, casting warm, golden light across the velvet armchairs. At our usual corner table, Evelyn Hawthorne was sitting with a soft, radiant smile, a large teapot steaming gently between 3 porcelain cups. Beside her sat Liora, wearing a comfortable cream-colored sweater, her long blonde hair loose over her shoulders, her green eyes warm and relaxed. There were no guards, no granite desks, and no corporate walls, just a family gathered around a table. As I took my seat beside Liora, she reached under the table, her fingers intertwining tightly with mine. Evelyn poured hot chamomile tea into my cup, winking at me with pure mischievous delight. "See, Cassian? I told you my daughter just needed someone who wasn't afraid of her." Liora laughed, a rich musical sound that filled the entire tea shop, leaning her head gently against my shoulder. "She was right, Cassian. I was waiting for someone to break through my fortress, but you were the only one who didn't care about the fortress at all. You just cared about me." I took a sip of the warm tea, looking at the two women who had completely transformed my world. I realized then that love is not always a grand, dramatic speech or a loud declaration. Sometimes, love is an old woman on a park bench in the rain. Sometimes, love is a folded note left on a restaurant table. And sometimes, love is simply finding the one person who isn't afraid to walk through your silence and stay. If you ever find yourself watching someone who seems distant, cold, or untouchable, don't walk away too quickly. Look closer. Their walls might not be built to keep you out. They might just be waiting for the one person brave enough to stay until the storm passes. In the weeks following our reunion at the tea shop, our lives settled into a steady, peaceful cadence. The boardroom at Hawthorne Global remained an arena of sharp strategy and decisive leadership, but the atmosphere on the executive floor had visibly shifted. Employees noticed that Director Hawthorne's posture was less tense, that her green eyes occasionally reflected a quiet warmth during operational briefings. Though we maintained our professional boundaries during working hours, there was an unspoken understanding between us. A shared foundation built not on corporate ambition, but on mutual respect, shared hardship, and the quiet truth of two people who had found each other through the storm.